Welcome to Just a Social Worker podcast with your host, Lori Eldred, licensed clinical social worker and therapist. Welcome to the podcast that's going to talk about social work in very real ways. We're going to talk about the things going well, the pressing issues and needs, and things that we really need to change about social work. I hope you enjoy our conversations, the insights, the thoughts, and even some of the actions we can take to make our profession, our lives, and our worlds better. Enjoy the podcast. Hi, gang. Welcome back to Just a Social Worker with Lori Eldred. I wanted to jump on really quick, just had a few thoughts about recent events, which seem to be coming pretty fast, quickly and deeply, kind of to most of us in the United States, especially, but just worldwide. So I wasn't sure how I wanted to approach this episode, given the tidal wave of events happening both in Minnesota and nationwide. And even when I wrote the script for this episode, thinking about all that's happening with the Epstein files, who's being exposed, and who folks are starting to know a little bit more about. I'm not sure about you, but even with all the things happening, I know through my social work lens, it feels often way too much for my nervous system to try to take in as well as to understand. I think I have realized recently I often feel a bit paralyzed at times and even avoidant of what is happening. Not that I don't believe that it's happening, but just what is happening is hard to take in. It seems that this is just maybe my own way, and I'm sure some of you can identify of managing what is happening. But I do want people to know this, something I've been really thinking deeply about and trying to kind of sit with and wrestle with in various ways, but that you're not alone in how you're feeling. This isn't anything new. There is a long history of the United States using the federal government against its people. There's a long history of these ebbs and flows, of this conflict, derision, this real political and deep disagreement on who should be counted and included, who is considered legal and not legal, who is considered a person, even in the United States. And I will throw some links in this episode, just some folks doing some really good work. Heather Cox Richardson is one I would absolutely recommend that you follow, just because she has such a comprehensive view of the history of the United States. And she likes to dig into the details, which I think make a very interesting and compelling reason to talk to her, to really watch and follow her stuff. And the stories she tells is pretty amazing. So the history that we've seen happened during 9/11 with Muslim American population and happened in the 70s to Black activists, Asian, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. We can kind of start to move back and back. It happened with Jim Crow laws. It happened in the Civil War. It happened before the Civil War. It happened in the founding of the United States. So if you do not think it has happened to marginalized groups in the U.S., you really need to read the work, like I said, of Heather Cox Richardson. I also just recently read the autobiography of Ashada Shakur, and she did an amazing job of just really looking at the activist work in the 70s with the Black liberation movement, and really identified that the government was targeting, keeping tabs, and using its full weight and force to intimidate and squash many of not just Black liberation and Black activist groups, but the Indigenous activist groups, Latinx, Asian, throughout the 70s. So it happened at the state level in the South during the civil rights movements in the 90s and 60s, including having to activate National Guard to desegregate schools, investigate murders of activists, and generally address the systemic and legal segregation in the South. So we saw down South in the 50s and 60s, and even decades and centuries before that, the government being used as a force of control and coercion, maintaining the system and status quo, and really helping whites benefit from segregation and systems of oppression. So I say all of this just to really outline what we're experiencing here is not necessarily new. Within our context, our time, and the way we're living now, it feels new for many of us. But I think if we take a step back and look at the long picture, It's not new. And what I listed is more current events, but the history of the US is littered with these events, as well as the founding, like I said, is rooted in the use of force and power against groups to quell dissent and to keep and maintain power. I know I'm saying this in very simplistic terms, and I also understand it is way more complex. I know what is happening is not okay by any shot, and being a social worker, so I'm going to bring this back. Being a social worker, we are obligated to get active, use our voices, be political, and have conversation on how to do this. Maybe not necessarily with a specific candidate, but helping people contact the representative, register their concern, and support those in their community are some quick ways that we as social workers can be more politically active and be more involved. What I also know is that I like to have resources and a bit of a plan. And here is my plan. Follow Heather Cox Richardson on social media, read the perspectives of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities and activities. So much as white people, as white social workers, our history is withheld from us, or our history is written in a way that supports and benefits white communities and white people. Use 5 calls to make your rep know how you feel about their lack of action, maybe that you feel it's unacceptable, or even things that you know representatives could do, should be doing, or want to see them doing. Get involved with your local mutual aid organizations to support local work and build community. And I think we can do that through some of these various steps. We need support and connection because we cannot, as social workers, do this work without community and support. I also want to jump in and add a little bit of a follow up. So I did an episode, a few episodes ago, and I think it was when I was talking to At Social Work is Political with Jaxie, and the Department of Education is proposing rule changes to make the social work profession seen as a non-professional group in order to limit the amount of student loan and federal and financial aid, that is accessible. So the Department of Education has now opened up for comments. And so I'm going to drop a link in the show notes here where you can and let the Department of Education know your concern, your frustration, your opinion, and the real harm that changing the classification of the social work profession can do to the profession in general. Again, if we're looking through this lens of like who is benefiting from some of these changes, the benefit probably will be to folks who are wealthier, who maybe have greater access to resources. And we have to ask our questions in terms of are those the only people we want in the social work profession? Do we want folks with lived experiences, folks across different economic situations, across different race, gender, political belief systems? And so we really need to take a look at what could those real changes do to our profession, and we need to speak up about that. And I know this is a real short episode, but if you like what you're hearing, please click the follow button and rate and review me so others can find me. Share it with a social work friend or colleague. And if you're interested in other work that I'm doing, you can check out my website, which is www.justasocialworker.com. Or I'm also on Instagram at Just a Social Worker Podcast, or I'm there underneath my name, which is Lori Eltred _LMSW _CAADC. I hope that this short episode was helpful in just kind of really conceptualizing that the events we are in are not necessarily new in the pattern of the United States. Yes, it might be a new reiteration of what is happening, but I think some of the fundamental building blocks, the essential experience of some of this that we're seeing with what's happening in Minnesota, with the Epstein files, the real disconnect within our legislature, in our federal government, the way the government at federal, even state levels are being used to quell dissent, the very process of trying to reduce who has access to voting, who has access to resources, who can use their voice. These are not new in our world and in the United States, and we really need to understand that. So hopefully you have a great week, and I will see you later.
Thank you for listening to Just a Social Worker podcast with your host, Lori Eldred, LMSWC. All information in this show is not a substitute for therapy and is only intended for entertainment only. Should you need help, please reach out to 988 or your local mental health resource.